53 years after my wife found me dressed as another woman and left me, she wrote me one letter. She was dying, and she needed to tell me something she'd hidden for half a century, something that would change everything I thought I understood about the night my marriage ended. I sat in her sunroom, an old man across from an old woman, and she took my hand and said, "I was there. I was more there than either of us could handle at the time." What she told me next didn't just explain her, it explained a truth about both of us we'd been too afraid to speak for 53 years. Stay with me till the end, because this isn't a story about betrayal. It's a story about how long love can wait to be understood. And if you're new here, welcome to Mr. Sister Studio. We tell real, honest stories about identity, relationships, and the courage it takes to become who you really are. So, if that's something you connect with, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there's a new story like this one every day. From the outside, I looked like I had everything under control. But inside, I was living a double life, hiding the side of me I was most afraid to show. And when the person I trusted the most discovered my secret, everything changed. So stay with me till the end, because this isn't just my story, it's a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how powerful self-discovery truly is. I was born in a house where silence was treated like a virtue. My father believed that feelings made a man weak, and my mother believed that survival meant keeping peace at any cost. We lived in a small town where everyone knew one another's names, cars, church seats, and family reputations. In a place like that, difference wasn't just noticed, it was remembered. People carried each other's business the way some people carry prayer books close to their chest, ready to open them at the first opportunity. I learned early that being seen could be dangerous, especially if what people saw in you didn't fit the script they had already written for your life. When I was 6 years old, my mother took me with her to a department store in the next town over because she said the stores there had better prices and fewer gossipy women. While she searched through blouses on a sale rack, I wandered toward a display of soft scarves and women's gloves. I still remember the pale blue gloves with tiny pearl buttons on the wrist. I touched them because they looked delicate, elegant, almost magical. There was something about the texture, the softness, the quiet beauty of them that stirred something in me I didn't yet understand. It wasn't lust. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition, though I didn't have that word yet. It felt like finding a secret room inside myself and stepping into it for just 1 second before the door slammed shut. My mother saw me holding those gloves and yanked my hand away so fast my fingers stung. She looked around to make sure no one had noticed, then bent down and whispered through clenched teeth, "Those are not for you." That should have been a small moment, forgettable even, but it wasn't. It was the first time I understood that some parts of me needed to be hidden not because they were wrong in any real sense, but because other people would decide they were. By the time I was 12, I had already become an expert at dividing myself into compartments. There was the version of me that played baseball, nodded at the right jokes, and lowered his voice around other boys. Then there was the hidden me, the one who waited for the house to empty so I could slip quietly into my mother's room, touch the fabrics hanging in her closet, and imagine what it would feel like not to be pretending for once in my life. I never took anything at first. I only looked. Then I started trying on a scarf, then a pair of shoes, then a skirt I could barely zip. My heart pounded every time, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt too right. I would stand in front of the mirror and see, not a joke, not a freak, not a dirty secret, but a softer version of myself, a truer one. And then I would hear the garage door open or a car pull into the driveway, and I would tear everything off with shaking hands and shove it back where it belonged, hating myself for needing something I could never explain. Shame became my first real religion. I prayed not to be changed into who I was, but to be changed out of it. I begged God to make me normal, though I didn't even know what normal meant. I read my father's moods like weather reports and listened to the way men in town talked about anyone who seemed feminine, artistic, different, weak. Every insult landed like a warning shot. Don't be that. Don't look like that. Don't move like that. Don't want what you want. And so I became careful. I learned to laugh at the jokes before anyone could suspect I was the punchline. I learned to date girls because that's what was expected. I learned to bury my tenderness under routine, manners, and good grades. But buried things don't disappear. They wait. They breathe under the surface. They grow roots in the dark. When I was 16, I met her. Her name was Eleanor, though everyone called her Ellie. She had a way of listening that made you feel like your words mattered even before you said them. She wasn't the loudest girl in the room or the prettiest in the way magazines define beauty, but she had presence. Calm, steady, curious presence. She had deep brown eyes that stayed on your face when you spoke, and a laugh that never sounded mean, even when she was teasing you. The first time we really talked was at the public library, where she was shelving books after school for extra money. I had gone there to study, or at least that's what I told myself. The truth is, I knew she'd be there because I had started arranging my life around accidental encounters with her. She asked what I was reading and I lied, saying Hemingway because I wanted to sound serious. She smiled and said, "You don't look like a Hemingway person." I asked what that meant, and she said, "You look like someone who notices details, and people who notice details usually read poetry or sad novels." I laughed, but inside I felt exposed in the gentlest possible way. No one had ever described me so accurately after knowing me for less than 5 minutes. We became friends before we became anything else, and maybe that's why losing her later felt like losing the roof over my head. She saw the version of me I presented to the world, yes, but she also saw the spaces between my words. She'd ask if I was okay, when everyone else thought I looked fine. She would sit beside me in silence without turning it into a problem. Once, after a football game, when the guys were celebrating and acting bigger than life, she found me alone behind the bleachers. I told her I just needed air. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know, you don't always have to act strong with me." That sentence hit me harder than any insult ever had. Because strength was the costume I wore every day, and suddenly there was this girl standing in front of me saying I could take it off. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not then. Maybe not ever, I thought. We started dating in our senior year, and for a while it felt like life had chosen mercy for once. With Ellie, I could laugh. I could dream. I could imagine leaving our town, getting married, building a quieter life somewhere people minded their own business. She wanted to be a teacher. I planned to study accounting because it seemed safe and respectable and stable. We talked about curtains and coffee makers and imaginary children with serious names. We were young enough to believe love alone could organize the chaos of a life. But even in those happiest moments, there was always a locked room inside me. The deeper our relationship grew, the more terrified I became. Loving her meant wanting to be known by her, and being known by her felt impossible. I thought if I told her the truth, even a partial truth, I would watch admiration turn into confusion, then pity, then disgust. I had never seen a model for honesty that didn't end in punishment. So I did what many frightened people do. I told myself I was protecting her, when really I was protecting my illusion of safety. I married her at 24. She wore a simple ivory dress, and I remember thinking she looked like grace itself. Everyone said we were lucky, that we fit so naturally together. Our wedding pictures still tell that lie beautifully. In every photograph, I am smiling like a man who has finally outrun his past. But secrets do not stay behind simply because you changed your address. They move in with you. They learn the floor plan. They wait until you begin to feel at home, and then they speak. The first years of our marriage were busy in the ordinary ways that make life feel legitimate. We rented a small house with peeling paint and a wild rose bush nobody knew how to tame. I worked long hours. Ellie taught 3rd grade and came home with stories about children who mispronounced words in ways that made her laugh until she cried. We struggled with bills, then slowly steadied ourselves. We hosted neighbors for dinner. We fought about small things like who forgot to buy milk and who left wet towels on the bed. It was, by all appearances, a real marriage. And it was real in many ways. I loved her. That part was never fake. What was fake was the completeness of the version of me she had agreed to spend her life with. Every so often, when she visited her sister for the weekend or stayed late at school for parent conferences, I would unlock the part of myself I had padlocked since boyhood. I began buying clothing in secret from stores out of town. Nothing extravagant at first. A blouse. A skirt. A pair of stockings wrapped in brown paper and hidden beneath old tax files in the garage. Later it became wigs, makeup, perfume, a compact mirror, heels I only wore on the carpet, so the sound wouldn't betray me. I created a ritual around these stolen hours. I would shower, shave carefully, choose each item with reverence, and transform in the bedroom with the curtains drawn. The first time I saw myself fully dressed, with lipstick trembling on my mouth and a cheap chestnut wig framing my face, I cried so hard I had to sit on the floor. Not because I looked beautiful. I didn't, not in any polished sense. I cried because for the first time, the chaos inside me had a shape. There was a person there. Fragile, frightened, unfinished, but real. I gave her a name I never said aloud at first. Marianne. I don't know why that name came to me. Maybe because it sounded tender. Maybe because it belonged to no one in my family and therefore carried no judgment. Maybe because naming her made her undeniable. Marianne became the keeper of everything I couldn't live without and couldn't confess. When I dressed, I did not feel like I was pretending to be someone else. I felt like I was finally stopping the pretense for a little while. But every moment of comfort was followed by twice as much guilt. Afterward, I would strip off the clothes, scrub the makeup from my face, bag everything carefully, and return to being the man everyone knew. Then I would sit at the kitchen table waiting for Ellie's key in the door and wonder whether love built on a mission could survive the weight of truth. Years passed that way, my life becoming a series of alternating performances. Husband, professional, neighbor, secret self, penitent, repeat. I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone as long as she never found out. That is one of the cruelest lies fear teaches us. The hidden life doesn't only injure people when it is exposed. It injures them through distance, through absence, through all the moments when intimacy could have deepened but didn't because one person kept a wall intact. Ellie began to sense it long before she had evidence. She would ask if something was bothering me. She would look at me across dinner and say, "You're here, but you're not here." Once, during an argument I can no longer remember the beginning of, she shouted, "Why do I always feel like there's a room in you I'm not allowed to enter?" I froze because she had named the exact architecture of my life. I denied it, of course. I accused her of imagining problems. I apologized for being tired, stressed, distracted. She accepted those explanations because when you love someone, you often prefer a manageable lie to a terrifying possibility. Then one autumn afternoon, everything came apart. She had gone to visit a friend, or so I thought, and I came home early from work because a client meeting was canceled. The house was empty. Or I believed it was. I don't know what made me do it that day. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe arrogance. Maybe the accumulated weight of denying myself had become too much. I went to the garage, unlocked the cabinet, carried the boxes upstairs, and became Marianne while the late sunlight spilled across the bedroom floor. I remember the outfit clearly, because memory is cruel that way. A dark green dress with a fitted waist, sheer stockings, pearl earrings that clipped onto my ears, and a soft cream cardigan. I remember looking in the mirror and thinking, if Ellie met me like this as a stranger, would she see a person or a betrayal? I did not hear her come in. I heard only the bedroom door open behind me and the sharp sound of her breath stopping. When I turned, she was standing there with one hand still on the doorknob, her face emptied of every expression except shock. There are moments when time doesn't slow down, it breaks. That was one of them. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. She looked at me from wig to heels to trembling hands, and then, in a voice so quiet it terrified me more than screaming would have, she said, "Who are you?" Not what are you? Not why. Who? I think that question split me more deeply than anything that came after, because I realized I didn't know how to answer it in a single sentence. I said her name. I said Ellie. I said please. I said it's me. She took a step back as if I had moved toward her, though I hadn't. Then she asked the question I had dreaded for decades. How long? I told the truth because there was no point in lying now. Since I was a child, I said. She stared at me, and the hurt in her eyes changed shape. It wasn't only shock anymore. It was calculation, reinterpretation. The rapid rearranging of an entire shared life. She asked if I was gay. I said no. She asked if I wanted to be a woman. I said I didn't know how to explain it. She asked if I had been seeing someone else. I said no, never. She asked if our marriage had all been fake. I said no, I love you. That was the truest thing I said, and the least useful in that moment. She began to cry then, not theatrically, not loudly, but like someone whose body has received a message too large to process. She sat on the edge of the bed and covered her face. I reached for her, forgetting for one stupid second what I looked like, and she flinched. That flinch still lives inside my bones. I went into the bathroom and wiped off the lipstick with shaking hands while she sat in the next room learning that the man she had married was both familiar and unknown. We talked for hours, if what we did can be called talking. It was more like surviving the blast radius of truth. She asked whether I had ever planned to tell her. I couldn't say yes because that would have been a lie. I couldn't say no because admitting that would make the betrayal sound even more deliberate. So I said I was afraid. She laughed bitterly and said, "Afraid of what, me?" I said, "Afraid of losing you." And she answered, "You should have been." We did not sleep in the same room that night, or the night after. The days that followed were not dramatic in the way movies understand drama. No plates were smashed. No one packed a suitcase in tears while music swelled. Real devastation is quieter than that. Ellie went to work. I went to work. We brushed our teeth in shifts. We spoke only when necessary. Sometimes I found her sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. Sometimes I heard her crying in the bathroom with the tap running. Sometimes she would ask another question, practical on the surface, but impossible underneath. Did you wear my things? Did anyone else know? Did you ever do this when I was home? Were you laughing at me all these years? That last one destroyed me. I said never. I was never laughing at you. I was hiding from myself. But hiding from myself had also meant hiding from her, and there was no way to make that distinction matter. We tried to salvage things. To this day, people think collapse happens because no one tried. That is not always true. Sometimes people try with everything they have and still fail because the wound is older than the apology. Ellie suggested counseling, then withdrew the suggestion before we made the call, saying she couldn't bear speaking about it aloud to a stranger. I suggested honesty. Full honesty. Any question, any answer. She said honesty now felt like receiving a gift after being robbed. Still, for a few months, we circled each other in the wreckage trying to locate what could be saved. I told her more than I had ever told anyone. About the gloves in the store. About the scarf in my mother's closet. About Marianne. About the fact that dressing this way had never felt like a joke, or a fetish I could simply switch off, but a language my soul had been trying to speak since I was small. She listened sometimes with compassion, sometimes with numbness, sometimes with visible pain. Once she asked me, if I had met me before we married, would you have told me? I said I wanted to believe I would. She shook her head and said, "That's not an answer." She was right. Eventually, she said the sentence I knew was coming long before she said it. "I don't know how to be your wife and also carry this secret with you." I asked if she meant temporarily. She said, "I don't know." But I heard the truth beneath it. We separated the following spring. No scandal exploded because we did what respectable people often do. We translated catastrophe into vague language. Irreconcilable differences. Emotional distance. Changing needs. Friends took sides without understanding the war. Family members speculated. My father called Ellie foolish for giving up on a good marriage, and I nearly laughed at the cruelty of that because he had no idea how much of his definition of manhood had helped destroy it. My mother asked if there was another woman. I said in a way she would never understand, yes. Divorce was finalized a year later. I signed the papers in a plain office with fluorescent lights and a clock that ticked too loudly. When it was over, I went to my car and sat there for almost an hour because grief needs a body to pass through, and mine was the only one available. I had not lost her because I cross-dressed. I had lost her because I had built love on fear and asked her to inhabit a marriage where truth was rationed. That distinction matters. And yet even understanding that did not lessen the pain. For years after the divorce, I lived like a man who had survived a shipwreck, but still heard water in his ears. I moved to a different city under the excuse of career advancement. Really, I needed anonymity. I needed streets where no one knew the name my parents gave me or the role I had failed to perform convincingly enough. The city gave me space, but space is not the same as freedom. It simply removes witnesses. For a while, I let Marianne exist more openly in private. I rented an apartment with secure closets and blackout curtains. I bought better clothes, learned makeup from magazines, practiced walking in heels without hating my reflection. I even ventured out a few times at night to places where no one stared too long because half the room was made of people like me, people carrying versions of themselves that had been denied daylight. But even in those spaces, I was divided. Some people seemed radiant in their self-acceptance, while I remained haunted by Ellie's face in that bedroom doorway. Every joy I found arrived with an echo of loss. I dated no one seriously. A few women, one man, some kind conversations, some disastrous ones. The truth was I no longer trusted myself with another person's heart. How could I promise honesty when I was still discovering what honesty even required? In those years, the world changed faster than I did. Language changed. Visibility changed. What had once been whispered in back rooms began to appear in newspaper columns, television interviews, psychology journals, community centers. Words like gender identity and expression began circulating beyond the margins. Young people were speaking truths in public that my generation had been beaten into silence for even feeling. I admired them and envied them, and sometimes resented them for their bravery, because it illuminated my own lost decades. I sometimes wondered whether Ellie and I would have survived if we had been born 40 years later. If I had grown up with language instead of shame, with examples instead of warnings, with a therapist instead of a locked garage cabinet. But wondering changes nothing. History does not offer refunds. It only offers perspective, and often long after the cost has been paid. I heard about Ellie occasionally, through old mutual acquaintances, the careful kind of updates divorced people receive as if life after separation were a weather report. She stayed in our hometown for a while. Then she moved 2 counties over. She kept teaching. She never remarried. That fact pierced me more than I had a right to admit. Part of me wanted her to find someone kind, stable, deserving. Another part hated the idea of anyone else getting the version of her I had broken. Years turned into decades. My hair thinned. My shoulders softened. My face gathered the map of a life mostly spent in negotiation with itself. I built a career. I retired. I made friends who knew me partially and friends who knew me more fully. In certain circles, Marianne was no longer a ghost. She was simply me, or one true dimension of me, though I still never learned to say that without hesitation. I kept a box of old photographs in the hall closet, and every now and then, when rain made the world feel small enough to revisit, I would take them out. There we were in front of the rose bush. There we were at the lake. There we were at a Christmas party, wearing matching red sweaters like any other couple in a department store ad. Memory is unfair because it preserves warmth even when the living relationship is gone. I did not know whether Ellie hated me, pitied me, forgave me, or had simply filed me into the cabinet of things too painful to revisit. I told myself I would never know, and eventually I learned to live beside that ignorance. Then, when I was 78 years old, I received a letter. Not an email, not a phone call, not a message relayed through some mutual acquaintance, but an actual letter in an envelope with my name written in handwriting I knew before my mind fully placed it. Time does strange things to recognition. I had not seen Ellie's handwriting in more than half a century, but my body remembered it instantly. I sat at the kitchen table for 10 minutes, just looking at the envelope, afraid that opening it might collapse the distance I had spent a lifetime constructing around that grief. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper folded carefully in thirds.
Dear Daniel, it began.
No one had called me that in years. Most people used Dan. Some used a different name entirely, depending on the context. But there it was, Daniel, the name she had used when she loved me and when she was angry and when she needed me to listen. The letter was short. Too short for 53 years. She wrote that she had been thinking about me more often as she grew older, that age had a way of returning unfinished stories to the surface. She wrote that she was ill, though she did not specify how ill, and that there was something she needed to tell me in person if I was willing to hear it. She gave me an address and a date range, saying her niece was helping care for her and visitors were welcome in the afternoons. At the bottom she wrote, "I do not expect anything from you. But there are truths that become heavier when carried too long." My hands shook so violently, I had to set the letter down. I reread it 4 times, looking for hidden accusations, clues, motives. Why now? Why after 53 years? Why not say it in the letter? I almost didn't go. Age has a way of making us protective of whatever piece we have managed to assemble. I worried that seeing her would rip open old wounds for no purpose. I worried that she wanted absolution I didn't know how to give, or worse, that she wanted to offer forgiveness I didn't know how to receive. But beneath all the fear was something simpler. I still loved her. Not in the domestic way of shared bills and breakfast routines, but in the deep geological sense that some loves remain part of the terrain even after the building collapses. So I went. The drive took 3 hours. It rained for most of it, a thin gray rain that blurred the highway and made every mile feel like travel through memory. I rehearsed conversations that dissolved as soon as I imagined her actual face. I wondered whether she would recognize Mary and if she saw traces of her in me now, softened by time, less hidden, less theatrical, more integrated. I wondered whether she still blamed me. I wondered whether I still blamed myself enough for both of us. Her niece answered the door. She was kind in the professional, slightly cautious way people are when opening their homes to strangers who are not quite strangers. She led me to a sunroom at the back of the house, and there was Ellie in a high-backed chair by the window with a blanket over her lap. She was smaller than I remembered, as age makes us all, but unmistakably herself. The same eyes. The same way of holding silence in a room without making it uncomfortable. She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled with sadness and something like relief. "You came," she said. I almost said of course. But there are some truths that sound too sentimental when spoken aloud after decades of silence. So I said yes. We talked awkwardly at first, as elderly people often do, when discussing the weather to avoid discussing the years. Her niece brought tea and disappeared. We commented on the rain, on roads, on medication schedules, on retirement. It might have been absurd if it hadn't been so human. 2 people can lose a lifetime together and still begin again with tea. After a while, she looked directly at me and said, "You look gentler." I laughed softly and said, "Age does that." She shook her head. "No, not age. Acceptance, maybe." I felt my throat tighten because in that one sentence, she had acknowledged more than many people had in entire relationships. I asked how sick she was. She said sick enough to stop pretending time is unlimited. Then she folded her hands over the blanket and said, "I asked you here because there's something I never told you, and I should have." I waited. She took a breath. "Do you remember the night after I found you in the bedroom?" I nodded. I remembered every second of it. She said, "After you went to sleep in the other room, I stayed awake until dawn. I cried, I got angry, I tried to make sense of everything. But there was another feeling too, and I buried it because I hated myself for having it." I asked what feeling. She looked out at the rain on the glass and said, "Recognition." I didn't understand. She continued before I could speak. "When I was young, before we met, I used to put on my brother's clothes when I was alone in the house. Not because I wanted to be a man, exactly. It's still hard to explain. But when I wore those clothes, I felt stronger, freer, less trapped in what was expected of me. I would flatten my hair, stand in front of the mirror, and imagine walking through the world without being watched the way girls are watched, judged the way girls are judged. I never told anyone. Not you, not my sister, no one." I stared at her. The room suddenly very still. She gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I know it isn't the same. I'm not claiming our experiences were identical. But when I saw you that day in the dress, after the shock, after the hurt, there was a part of me that understood more than I wanted to. And that terrified me almost as much as your secret did. I felt as if the floor had shifted under everything I thought I knew not only about you, but about myself. I could barely speak. 53 years. 53 years she had kept that inside. She went on. I was so angry at you for not telling me, and I had every reason to be. But I was also angry because some part of me had spent my whole life following rules I never chose, and there you were, however clumsily, however painfully, living out something I had buried so deep I wouldn't even name it. I thought your secret had destroyed our marriage. Maybe it did. But my fear helped destroy it too. My need for certainty. My terror of being pulled into questions I had spent my life avoiding. The tears came then, sudden and old. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She laughed softly, the sound edged with regret. "The same reason you didn't tell me, I suppose."
Shame.
Timing.
Pride.
Survival. Pick anyone. Or all of them. She said that after the divorce, she had tried to convince herself she had done the only possible thing. Some days she still believed that. But other days she wondered what might have happened if they had both been brave earlier, before betrayal hardened everything. If we had met each other with truth before the truth became a weapon, she said, maybe we would still have parted. But maybe we would have parted with less damage. Or maybe we would have built something stranger and more honest than the marriage we had. I'll never know. I asked if she had hated me. She answered with more kindness than I deserved. I hated what happened. I hated how lonely I felt standing in the middle of a marriage I suddenly couldn't recognize. I hated how much of your life I hadn't been invited into. But I never hated you. Not even then. I carried love and anger together for years. They made each other heavier. We sat there for a long time, talking in circles and straight lines, returning to moments that had calcified into private mythology. She asked if I had ever found peace. I told her not all at once, not permanently, but enough to breathe easier than I used to. I told her Marianne was no longer a name hidden in a locked cabinet. I told her I had learned that identity is sometimes less about choosing a single word and more about refusing to amputate the truths that coexist inside you. She nodded as if that made sense to her. Maybe because at the end of life, many binaries lose their authority. She said she had spent years reading quietly, trying to understand the world that had not existed in language when we were young. She had thought about writing to me many times, but feared reopening what she assumed I had worked hard to close. Then her diagnosis came, and with it the realization that silence does not become nobility simply because it lasts a long time. Sometimes it is just silence. Sometimes it is fear aging in place. We met 3 more times that month. Each visit peeled away another layer of misunderstanding. We talked about our parents, about the violence of gender expectations disguised as normalcy, about the stupid tragedies that happen when people are taught to perform themselves instead of inhabit themselves. She told me she had once envied men for their freedom and despised them for it at the same time. I told her I had envied women for their permission to be soft and feared them for their power to expose what I hid. We laughed at things that would have destroyed us half a century earlier. We also cried. There was no miraculous rewriting of the past. We did not become lovers again. We did not move in together and spend our final years wrapped in cinematic redemption. Life is rarely so decorative. What happened was smaller and, to me, more sacred. We told the truth. At last, without needing it to produce a particular outcome. One afternoon she asked if I had ever blamed her for leaving. I answered honestly. Sometimes. When I was younger, yes. It was easier than blaming myself. But as I got older, I realized you left a marriage I had never fully let you enter. She looked at me steadily and said, and I punished you for not knowing how to explain something the world gave you no language for. We were both casualties of a small world. That sentence has stayed with me ever since. We were both casualties of a small world. Not because our love was small. It wasn't. But because the world around us had trained our imaginations to be smaller than our truths. In another life, perhaps we would have had better tools. In this one, we had fear, secrecy, instinct, longing, and the stubborn hope that maybe love could survive what honesty had not yet touched. Near the end of my last visit, she asked if I had ever kept anything from our marriage. I told her yes, the photographs. She smiled and said she kept some too. Her niece brought out an old tin box, and inside were snapshots, ticket stubs, a restaurant receipt from our 10th anniversary, and one Polaroid I had never seen. My stomach dropped when I realized what it was. It was me, or rather, it was Marianne. Younger, awkward, standing near the bedroom dresser in that green dress from the day everything ended. The photograph had been taken from the doorway. I looked up at Ellie in shock. She said, "I took it that afternoon before I spoke because I think some part of me knew my memory would turn it into a monster if I didn't keep proof of what I actually saw." "And what did you see?" I asked. She looked at the photograph for a long time before answering. A frightened person. Not a monster. Not a joke. Just a frightened person dressed like truth had finally cornered them. I broke then. Fully, openly, without restraint. I had spent decades imagining that image through her eyes as grotesque, humiliating, unforgivable. And all that time she had carried a photograph not as blackmail, not as evidence of betrayal, but as proof to herself that what she had witnessed was more complicated than panic allowed her to admit. Before I left that day, she reached for my hand. Her skin felt paper-thin and warm. She said, "I don't know what comes after this, Daniel. Maybe nothing dramatic. Maybe just relief. But I needed you to know that I was there. I was more there than either of us could handle at the time." Those were the words from the title of the story, though not exactly as I first understood them. For years I thought the tragedy was that she wasn't there for me when the truth came out. But what she meant was something deeper. She had been there emotionally, psychologically, humanly, in ways neither of us had known how to trust. She had recognized something in me, because there were buried rooms in her too. She waited 53 years not because she didn't care, but because caring and speaking are not always twins. Sometimes people care enormously and still remain silent because the truth threatens the scaffolding of the entire life they built to survive. Ellie died 6 weeks after that first letter. Her niece called me the morning after and said Ellie had asked that I be told personally. I attended the memorial at the back of the church, mostly unnoticed, just another old man with watery eyes and careful posture. They spoke about her teaching, her patience, her generosity, her roses. All true. But I sat there holding another truth as well, one almost no one in that room would ever know. The woman they were mourning had been larger than the life assigned to her. She had held contradictions with more grace than I understood when we were young. She had once loved me, left me, remembered me, and finally returned not to reopen a wound but to name the hidden kinship beneath it. After the service, her niece found me outside, near the parking lot. She handed me the Polaroid in a small envelope and said, "She wanted you to have this." I almost refused. It felt too intimate, too dangerous, too heavy with history. But I took it. At home, I placed it on my desk and stared at it for hours. There I was, caught in the doorway between concealment and exposure, between self and performance, between one life and the wreckage of another. I expected the picture to shame me all over again. Instead, it softened something. Because now I knew I was being seen not only by my own terrified memory, but by hers. And her gaze, however shocked, had also contained recognition. Since then, I've told this story only a handful of times. Usually people want simple morals. Be yourself. Tell the truth. Love conquers all. But life is not a greeting card, and truth arrives with splinters. Sometimes being yourself costs you the love of your life. Sometimes telling the truth too late still matters. Sometimes love does not conquer all, but it leaves evidence that what existed was real even if it could not survive the conditions around it. If you're listening to me right now, and you're hiding some essential part of yourself, I want to be careful with what I say next. I will not romanticize disclosure. Not everyone is safe. Not every truth can be spoken in every room. Survival is real. Risk is real. But so is the damage of living indefinitely in fragments. Secrets shape relationships even before they are revealed. They make architects out of fear. They turn love into guesswork. And if you are the one loving someone whose truth unsettles your understanding of them, I hope you'll remember this too. Shock is human. Hurt is human. Boundaries are human. But certainty is often overrated. Sometimes the person in front of you is not betraying you by being complicated. Sometimes they are simply arriving late to themselves. I lost the love of my life. Yes, that part is true. But the truth underneath the title is stranger than loss. I also found, after 53 years, that the woman I believed had only recoiled from my secret had actually been standing closer to its emotional edge than I ever knew. She waited half a century to tell me she was there, and by then we were old, scarred, far beyond the age when people expect revelation to matter. But it did matter. It mattered because being understood late is still a form of grace. It mattered because regret named aloud becomes something other than rot. It mattered because in a world that had taught both of us to divide ourselves for survival, we managed at the end to offer one another wholeness, however briefly. I still keep the letter in my bedside drawer. The paper has begun to yellow at the folds. Some nights, when sleep stays far away and memory sits too close, I take it out and read the line about truths becoming heavier when carried too long. I think about all the lives being lived right now behind locked doors, behind practiced smiles, behind marriages and jobs and reputations and churches and family dinners. I think about how many people are not lying because they are cruel, but because they were taught that honesty would exile them from love. And I think about how many people, like Ellie, are carrying recognitions they never speak because to admit them would rearrange the story they tell about themselves. We were not villains in each other's lives. That is another truth age has given me. We were not heroes either. We were frightened people shaped by a frightened era, reaching for love with hands already full of inherited shame. If I could go back, I would tell her sooner. I would tell myself sooner. I would refuse the fantasy that silence can protect what it actually poisons. I would let the marriage begin with risk instead of rupture. Maybe it would still end. Maybe not. But at least the ending would belong to truth rather than its absence. And if Ellie could speak to you now, I think she would say something similar from the other side. Ask the harder questions sooner. Stay curious 1 minute longer than your fear wants you to. Don't mistake shock for final understanding. Don't confuse the collapse of a story with the collapse of a soul. We were both more than the roles we failed to keep playing, and the older I get, the more I believe that most human suffering comes from trying to make life obey categories that were never wide enough to hold us. So yes, this is a story about betrayal, but not in the way you might think. It is about the betrayal of the self when fear becomes your manager. It is about the betrayal built into social rules that demand performance before they permit belonging. It is about the betrayal people feel when love discovers it has been living beside silence. But it is also about mercy. Mercy that arrives late. Mercy that doesn't erase consequences. Mercy that doesn't restore the marriage or return the lost years, but places a hand on the shoulder of memory and says, look again. Look more carefully. There was more understanding there than you knew. There was more kinship there than you dared hope. There was more love there, even broken love, than either of you had language to save. And maybe that is the hardest lesson of all. Love is not always enough to prevent damage, but sometimes it is enough to illuminate damage differently before the end. If you've ever felt split between the person the world rewards and the person your soul recognizes in the mirror, I see you. If you've ever discovered something about someone you loved that shattered your map of them, I see you too. If you've ever waited years, decades even, to say the one thing that might finally set memory down gently instead of dragging it behind you like a chain, then maybe you understand why I'm telling this now. Not for pity. Not for confession alone. But because stories like this often get flattened into scandal or reduced to labels, and real lives are messier, tenderer, and more tragic than labels can carry. I lost Ellie once when the truth exploded without preparation. I lost her again when she died. But between those losses, astonishingly, there was a return. A human return. Not to the past, but to recognition. She was there. She had been there in ways I did not understand. And at the end, when pretense no longer offered either of us any protection worth keeping, she chose to tell me. That choice has changed the way I think about all my broken years. It has not made them unbroken. But it has made them legible. And for a person who spent most of life hidden in plain sight, being legible at last feels like a miracle. So, if you take anything from my story, let it be this. The truth you fear may indeed cost you something precious.
I won't lie to you about that.
But the absence of truth costs too, often more quietly and over a longer period, until entire relationships are built around what cannot be said. And yet, even then, even after decades, even after failure, there remains the possibility of one final conversation that turns a closed wound into an understood scar.
I was not fully abandoned.
She was not fully uncomprehending. We were both more present in each other's secret lives than either of us admitted. That is what she waited 53 years to tell me. She was there. And now, after all this time, after all the hiding, after all the grief, after all the names and mirrors and doorways and delayed truths, I am here, telling you.